Hello, hello, everybody. How are we doing? Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending when you're joining us from. I do want to preface today, ladies and gentlemen, that yours truly is reeling from pneumonia. I know. So you may hear me cough. I'll try to mute myself if I think about it, but it may just happen. Welcome, everybody. Again, we see people are coming from different places. Welcome, welcome. Let us know again where you're coming from. We here at CCC are delighted to welcome you to our webinar today titled Achieving Interpreting Expertise, Applying Principles of Deliberate Practice to Interpreting Practice. So, as some of you may know, my name is Analia. I'm the manager of training and curriculum here at Cross Cultural Communications, the largest international training agency for community, educational, and medical interpreting. I will be your host today for this 1 hour presentation, webinar presentation. Also, with us today and behind the scenes is my colleague Andrew Hall, Cross Cultural Communications Publication Managers. Andrew will manage the chat and will provide useful information throughout the webinar. Thank you, Andrew. Now, as always, before we begin, and as we wait for everybody to really join us online, I would like to share some CCC updates. First of all, guess what? CCC is delighted to offer a live online session of our signature program, 40-hour program, the Community Interpreter International. Hey, if you are not already, become a professional interpreter in medical, educational, or social services settings. This interactive and engaging program takes place live online, started June 24th, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5:30, and Andrew will be posting a link for you to look at if you're interested. Second, registration is now open for the summer TCII-TOT, the Training of Trainers. This program licenses interpreters to deliver the Community Interpreter International program. The summer cohort starts on July 8th. If you have ever considered becoming a trainer, people, this is your time. TOT is the most trusted and comprehensive entry-level program in the field, the Community Interpreting International. So consider attending this online training of trainers and learn how to lead your own sessions of the only national 40-hour licensed certificate program for community, educational, and medical interpreting. This internationally famous TOT has licensed over 400 trainers across the United States and worldwide to deliver TCII. And Andrew right now kindly is going to post the link. Something else I want you to know, you may be interested, and there is also still time available to register. We have 2 one-day classes coming up. The first one is coming up this Saturday, May 11th. It's titled Inclusive Language. And Andrew's going to post the link. You can still register for that one. And the other one is Interpreting in Mental Health Settings. And that will be on June 12th. Last but not least, I know, we think about you. Even when you don't think about us, we're still thinking about you. This is one of the best advertisements right now, or announcements. You can take for free the Interpreter Credentials and Certification Program. If you take this class, this is a key part of both the TCIO and TMIO, and it is for free. And Andrew is posting a link. Now, I will go over a few points regarding the webinar. Again, the webinar presentation will last between 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A 20-minute period in which you can ask your questions to the presenter. Please make sure during the webinar, keep the Q&A feature open and use the Q&A to submit your questions for our presenter. For other comments or questions for us here at Cross-Cultural Communications, please use the chat feature instead. And if you want everyone to see your comments in the chat, please make sure that you set your chat to everyone. Lastly, if you want to stay on after the webinar is over to ask any questions to Andrew and me, we will be happy to answer any questions you may have, both regarding cross-cultural communications and Blue Horizons. This webinar, as always, this is so exciting, has been approved for CEUs. I know I am an interpreter. I need my CEUs. Please remember, 24 hours after the webinar is over, not before, after it's over, attendees will be emailed a link to download a certificate of attendance. It will go to the same email you used to register for today's webinar. Please check your spam folder or junk folder if you don't see it at the beginning. Certificates are only available for attendees of the live session of the webinar. They must be downloaded within 2 months of today's session. Okay, enough of that, right? Now, without further ado, let's begin our webinar, Achieving Interpreting Expertise, Applying Principles of Deliberate Practice to Interpreting Practice. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Gilbert, who is joining us. Dr. Devin Gilbert is a translation and interpreting practitioner, educator, and researcher. He teaches Spanish, translation, and interpreting as an assistant professor at the Utah Valley University, Department of Languages and Cultures. Having undertaken his training at Wake Forest University's Master in Interpreting and Translation Studies program and Kent State University's PhD in Translation Studies program. Dr. Gilbert is also a board member of the Utah Translators and Interpreters Association. He enjoys developing software for the web, and in 2022, he started developing a web-based interpreting training platform that seeks to make quality, authentic interpreting practice dialogues more accessible and attractive. How cool is that? So, Dr. Gilbert, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Analia, and thank you to CCC for making this happen. This is certainly the largest audience I've had the pleasure of presenting for. I don't think I was anticipating 604 participants, and so this is really exciting. So I'm going to jump in just as a general outline of what I hope to achieve today. We're going to take, let's see, I think I maybe shared I think I need to share my screen. Didn't do that quite yet. All right, there we go. So a general outline of what I hope to achieve today. We're going to talk about deliberate practice. And so this is a concept that comes from psychology. It comes from expertise studies, kind of a cognitive branch of psychology. And we're going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes talking about deliberate practice. And then my hope is to send you guys a link to a quiz/survey. And so just know that at a certain point in the presentation, I'll throw a link into the chat, and then you'll be able to just follow that link to take the quiz. After that, I would like to show you a little bit about TERP and how I think it can be used to achieve deliberate practice in interpreting training. And then I've got sort of a handout that will be sent to you afterwards. But beforehand, during the presentation right now, I'll just share it on my screen and you'll have the opportunity to try to design your own deliberate practice regimen for interpreting. So my background, just wanted to share my background with Wake Forest and Kent State. Why that's important is because Wake Forest has a huge focus on interpreting. And so at heart, I'm an interpreter. I've worked as a freelance interpreter in medical contexts, mostly, and also in education. And I really, really enjoy interpreting. And when I started teaching interpreting at Utah Valley University, the first thing I noticed is it was really difficult to give students a quality, authentic practice experience at home. It was a lot easier in the classroom because we could role play. However, once they get home, it became more difficult. And so that's why I started a company called TERP. And I'll go more into that, but basically it's a way to practice interpreting online. And then with Kent State, that was, a program that was focused more on translation studies, broadly speaking, but that's where I got my introduction to software development, just because my dissertation advisor there, Michael Carl, was a computer science professor. And so I learned a lot about software. And so that's kind of what is leading into TERP. All right, so let's get into deliberate practice. Here's a borrowed definition of interpreter training. It's a definition that I really like, and I'm borrowing it from expertise studies. This is actually from, I think, medical contexts where they're talking about how do you become an expert physician. So right here it says an activity of self-regulated learners, that is, members of the interpreting community who have the tools to improve their own and their team members' performances throughout their entire professional careers. So I don't think of interpreter training as what happens with a 40-hour course before you're able to work as a qualified interpreter, or as solely your preparation for taking, for example, a national certification exam. Rather, it's a continuing practice, and you have to become a self-regulated learner in order to engage in interpreter training. It's not something that someone bestows on you. It's something that you participate in actively, and it's a community effort. So I really love this definition from this researcher, Erickson. He's a cognitive studies, psychological expertise studies researcher. So I know that this is kind of a glib diagram, but it's really important for the interpreting profession because it's so easy as an interpreter to become isolated from other interpreters, especially if you're only working freelance. You probably don't have a ton of opportunities to be observed. You might not have a ton of opportunities to observe others, to engage in this community practice of sharing and giving feedback. And that's something that we need to break. We need to break that isolation in interpreting, wherever it may exist still. So let's talk about expertise. This is how researchers have defined expertise. You have to be able to measure the superiority of a performance, that in our case of an interpretation. And so that becomes really tricky in our field to measure, but that's, what is implied by the word objective. It has to be measurable in some way. And if it's a qualitative measurement, that's okay, because we're not likely to get a very good quantitative measurement for interpreting performance. But it's also, it can't just be a one-off success. It has to be something that you're able to do consistently. And so that's what expertise is. And so if we know expertise is, that we perform at a high level and we do that consistently, reproducibly, it's cyclical, it's not just every now and then. How do we achieve that? And that's where this term deliberate practice comes into play. And I'm taking this from a researcher that was at Kent State named Gregory Shreve, and he borrowed it in turn from this researcher Erickson. But here, kind of, I'm just trying to condense the nutshell requirements of deliberate practice. So the first thing is you have to have a properly defined task. And what is meant by that is it has to be essentially what is a predictable environment, in the sense that you can iterate, you can practice the same things over and over to get better at specific skills. So for example, basketball is a really easy example. The ball either goes in the hoop or it doesn't. That's a real easy definition. There are, of course, other aspects to basketball, but that's maybe one of the most important aspects. And then you have something like the stock market that is not a properly defined task. So trading in the stock market, it's not predictable. No one can become an expert at it per se, because index funds outperform the best traders. It's not something that's predictable. It just isn't. The next requirement that we need is appropriate difficulty. And so this is something that I try to build into TERP for my students at UVU, because they often get overwhelmed by the sudden flood of terminology. And that makes almost any medical context scenario too difficult for them. And so there's ways to try and mitigate that. And then once you advance in your career, you have to start looking for challenges. I know that, for example, some people who have been interpreting in courts for a long time, they can probably recite a DUI arraignment in both languages from memory while they're brushing their teeth, eating cereal, while they're doing whatever. It becomes a very routinized activity. And so you have to find ways of upping the difficulty as you go along in your career. But one of the most important requirements for deliberate practice is you have to have constructive feedback. And this is where the sense of community becomes so important, because in something like sports, the feedback's already there, in large part just by the nature of the activity itself. If you shoot a basket and it hits the rim, bounces off, doesn't go in the hoop, there's your constructive feedback. You didn't shoot to make the basket. And to a certain degree, that's there in interpreting, because if you're interpreting in a dialogue interpreting context, you can read your participants, how they're receiving the message, and you can kind of gauge it that way. But it's really goes a long way having a peer's feedback. So let's see, one more, that repetition. This is really, really important. When I started teaching interpreting, I kind of shied away from repetition because I thought, oh, that's not authentic. When you're interpreting in a hospital, you don't get to do a redo. Everything coming at you is new. However, as a training mechanism, repeating the same scripts, the same dialogues, can be a huge way to improve. because you can detect errors and correct them. That iteration, that repetition is crucial. So, sorry, it looks like, so to summarize, you have to have a goal. That's a properly defined task. And so when you're practicing, there might be certain things that you focus on. Maybe at a certain part of your career, you're saying, oh, okay, I need to focus more on register. I generally get the message across, but I don't convey it in the appropriate register for the situation. Or maybe in the beginning of your career, like I miss so much stuff when I interpret. I need to work on my memory and I need to work on not omitting anything. And so you need a goal when you're practicing, but more importantly, you have to have a plan for feedback. And that could be something you do on your own. When you're practicing at home, you can record yourself. That's a really good way for you to give yourself feedback by analyzing your own interpretations. However, in actual praxis in the field, can't really record yourself. And so you have to come up with more creative ways to get feedback. And then you have to have opportunities to repeat and improve. And luckily, there's a lot of scenarios that repeat themselves in interpreting. You know, you're going to do more than one IEP meeting as an education interpreter in your career. And so you'll have opportunities to repeat on that same terminology and improve. In cases where you're studying in a group or studying at home and it's practice that isn't oriented in a real context, you can repeat the same script over and over until you've improved on it. So before we go into me talking about TERP, I'm actually going to share with you all a link right now in the chat. So let me find that and paste it in. And this link will just take you to a Qualtrics survey. And that will give you a little quiz, very short quiz, as well as a survey where you can give a little feedback about how often you're able to, for example, observe other interpreters or be observed in your day-to-day work. So let's take, with that link, let's take about 7 minutes and let everyone have some time to work on that quiz/survey. And while people are doing that, I would be more than happy to respond to any questions that pop up in the Q&A. And I'll actually take a look at that right now. So about 6 minutes from now, 7 minutes from now, we'll go on with the presentation, but take some time to do the quiz. All right, so I'm going to look at some of the questions in the chat. Is there any truth to the so-called 10,000 hour rule? So there's a really interesting study they did on physicians that had been practicing for a long time, like 10 or more years, versus physicians who had just barely graduated med school. And the recent graduates were better at diagnosing less common disorders and conditions than the physicians who had 10 years of experience, which I dare say they probably had 10,000 hours of experience. And this just went to show that you need deliberate practice to be an expert, and that just gaining experience without having targeted goals and feedback isn't really enough. And so that's a great question. And I think that the 10,000 hours rule is isn't really a real rule. You have to have feedback and you have to have opportunities to repeat similar tasks. So Dana is saying it may be difficult to find any colleague to practice with or to have feedback from in a language other than Spanish. Yeah, that's very true. I know some people that interpret in language pairs that include indigenous languages, and I bet it's a lot more difficult. For them to find someone to give them feedback. And I'm going to show you some things that I hope to be implementing in the future with my platform TERP that I hope will help with that. I hope to help with the whole community building aspect of interpreting in the professional sense. Can you recommend a coach for interpreters with some experience? I think the best way to look for a coach or a mentor for any interpreter is your local interpreter association. So I'm on the board for Utah Translators and Interpreters Association. And the thing with the language industry is everyone tends to be pretty nice. So that's what I would recommend. The proposed quiz, well, the quiz, I don't know if I would call it mandatory, but it was part of the plan that was submitted for the CEUs. And so it is part of what the CEU granting organizations are expecting because it's a way for you to receive feedback. So I would say it's a good idea to take it. For those of you that might not have gotten the link, it's probably getting buried in the chat, and so that might make it a little bit difficult to get the link, but the quiz, the link to the quiz will be posted after the webinar, and so you'll be able to do it after this session as well, and it would be just as valuable. Claudia Lopez is asking recommendations to improve short-term memory during practice. I think the best way is to have contextualized practice. So for example, there are memory games that you can do that I did in my interpreting programs. And for example, at Wake Forest, where you were given a list just verbally, a list of 20 words, and they could be adjective, nouns, verbs, and they could be abstract or concrete, just totally random. And you just had to listen carefully and then see how many you could recite back. And the idea is you would use memory association techniques. So for example, you would chunk 4 concepts together. So chunking is really, really effective. Or you could create absurd narratives that were visual in your mind with the different concepts that you were hearing to associate them. Another method that some people liked, I don't think it worked very well for me, is that you would have like a common path, like going through your house and your backyard, and you would associate chunks of concepts with different objects or places in that mental path. And I remember at Wake Forest, for example, before they would let us do long consecutive interpreting, we had to get 15 out of 20. And I don't know if that's the best way or if it's better to have just contextualized examples, like where someone tells you something. For example, they list off a bunch of symptoms that they're experiencing, and then you interpret that or you repeat it in the same language, and that can help with short-term memory. And I think having it contextualized in a real dialogue can be helpful. And that's a good point from Suzanne. VRI interpreting with a team is a good way to get feedback across the miles if the team is willing. Because you can have someone observe you potentially a little more easily if it's remote. And there could be opportunities for that. I know of a remote interpreting agency in Utah that I think all of their new hires do 75 hours. That's supposed to be observed while they're interpreting, and it's all remote. Resources to train for long consecutive. I would go to the EU speech repository. That can be a good resource because you get 5-7 minute long speeches, and you could do long consecutive that way. All right, so that was 7 minutes, and I think the majority of you are done with the quiz/survey. And if you aren't done, that's okay, because there will be time to finish it later. And if you didn't get the correct link, then you can look for that in the email that will be sent out afterwards. All right, so we've got about 15 minutes left before we can start taking some questions. 15 to 20 minutes. So I'm going to share my screen again. And I would like to share with you, let me actually put this up on the screen first. Let's see here. So if any of you want to visit this website on your own devices right now, you're welcome to do that. You could scan this QR code, or the URL is quite simple. The domain name is just terp.app, terp.app. So let me tell you about how I think Terp can help with deliberate practice. I'm going to show you the website right now on my screen. I believe everyone should be able to see the website right now. We've got currently 17 practice dialogues, and let me kind of show you the dialogues. We have a myriad of different domains, so I think the majority are medical, but we also have some from business, education, legal. There's a few more coming from legal, also mental health and social services. So different domains of community interpreting, dialogue interpreting. And the idea is we should be publishing about one dialogue per week up until October of this year, because we have about 40 total so far. And these are, for now, all Spanish to English. And the idea behind these dialogues is this is not computer-generated content. This is not AI. This is highly curated content. These are all written by practicing interpreters, and they've been edited by me and other editors, and we record really good audio for them. And so let me show you an example of one of these dialogues. When you go to the demo, you can watch this tutorial video that will explain more of the interface. But essentially, you're given some contextual information. You know kind of who the participants are going to be in the dialogue, what languages they're speaking, and what varieties. So for example, here we've got Venezuelan, Spanish, someone from Venezuela. And the second half of the dialogue is where you would actually practice. And you can think of this as a script. And so here's kind of like a stage direction. Okay, the interpreter sees the doctor. Oh, and now I'm being prompted, follow the directions with these interpreter intervention blocks. I need to introduce myself to the doctor, which would only be natural, and do a pre-session. So the user would do that. my students, when they're practicing, they record themselves while they're practicing. And so they record their pre-session, and they're generally using something like Vimeo to record their screen and their microphone while they're practicing. Okay, and then you go into the patient's room, and I think I actually need to share my screen a different way. I don't know if I had shared the sound, so let me make sure I'm sharing the sound. And then you would listen to a piece of dialogue.
Hi there, what brings y'all in today?
And me as the user practicing at home, I would interpret, and I'm recording myself, whether that's on my phone or with a screen capture recording, however I want to do it. I could, I guess, even use a cassette tape recorder. Buenos días, ¿cuál es el motivo de la visita? And then you would go on to the next line of dialogue, which is the patient.
El comportamiento de mi hijo está raro últimamente. No sé qué le pasa, doctor. No para de llorar desde que se enfermó.
My son's been behaving really strangely lately. I don't know what's going on. He hasn't quit crying since he got sick. And right now, you know, I'm in the moment. I'm interpreting. I don't necessarily know how good my interpretation was. A lot of you that were watching me right now, you could probably give me really good feedback right now and tell me, hey, that was good, or hey, you missed a part. But if I'm working on my own, the idea is I'm recording myself so that I can later watch that recording and say, oh, I completely missed a part, because I can listen to it again.
El comportamiento de mi hijo está raro últimamente. No sé qué le pasa, doctor. No para de llorar desde que se enfermó.
And then I can say, well, did I miss a part? Did I not? I need the recording to actually think about that. And this is all on practice mode. And then what the user can do when they go back over their recording is they can go into review mode, and that way they can see example interpretations, and they can also see a transcript if they want. And that way they can compare their interpretation from their recording with an example interpretation. And this is constructive feedback. It's one of the necessary aspects of deliberate practice. You have to have constructive feedback. And this is a way for someone to give themselves constructive feedback. It's very similar to a lot of different interpreting practice materials that might be out there, but this makes it a lot more user-friendly. And another aspect of this is you can use something called role play mode. And so you could get together with a group or in a training program or whatever it might be. You could have one person act as the doctor and another person act as the patient, and you could role play. Or you could also get in a group and keep it in practice mode, and everyone listens to the audio and I interpret. And while I'm interpreting, my other classmates or my study mates, they're taking down notes. And then maybe after 3 minutes, they can say, hey, you missed this part. And here I would probably phrase it a little bit differently. And one thing that I hope to implement this summer, that I'm going to implement this summer, I should say, now that I'm not teaching a lot of classes during the summer, I have time to work on the development side of things. I'm going to be implementing a feature where you can record your interpretation within the website itself. And so for every single line, you can hit a button. You'll be able to hit a button and record your interpretation. And that will be saved in your account. And the idea then is that you can send it to a colleague, and you can pick which lines you want them to focus on. And then they can send you feedback. And so I hope to build in a lot more constructive feedback mechanisms and community building features right into the platform. Another thing that it has that I think is really important has these ethical dilemmas. And so in this example, I think the doctor kind of dubiously asks the mother, hey, but did you actually take his temperature when you say he has a fever? Did you measure it? And the mom whispers something to the interpreter, thinking the interpreter won't interpret it. And so the two options are stay quiet and don't interpret what the mom said, or interpret what the patient said. And depending on what you pick, you'll get kind of a choose your own adventure branching sort of result. And there are also blocks that we mark as simultaneous. You know, just naturally in the dialogue interpreting situation, there might be times where the doctor is doing a physical examination and he's saying things, she's saying things kind of in a paused way with long pauses between each thing they're saying. And so that might be a time when you naturally go into simultaneous. And what you can do currently on Terp, even though you can't record within the website itself, what you can do is you can paste a link to your screen capture video. So for example, I use the Vimeo Chrome extension. It's very easy to use. You can easily allow recording of your screen and your microphone. And then once you're done, you can put the link to that video right here, or you can even put the embed code right here, and you can type up some ideas you had about the practice session. And those will all be available to you in your profile that you can look at later, where you can look at your practice sessions. One thing you can currently do on Terp is you can create a community. And you don't have to have a subscription to do this. You can create a community, and then once you create it, you can add people to that community just by giving them a join code. And what I am going to build into the platform this summer is a way for communities to request feedback from each other. And so that way you can get a practice group together and you can get on the platform, do a practice session, record yourself, and then put that recording, that practice session out to your community and say, hey, what do you guys think? And on that request for feedback, you'll be able to select certain lines of the dialogue that you specifically want feedback for. And another thing that I hope to do is translate all of the dialogues that we currently have so that they're also available in all English. So both sides, all English. That way other languages would still be able to practice with the materials besides just English and Spanish. And even though there won't be an example interpretation for each line in that case, there would still be the opportunity to record yourself, send it out to your group of study companions and say, hey, what do you think about these lines? And that way they can critique your interpretations into a different target language other than Spanish. And so those are some of the ways that I think Terp will be really beneficial for interpreting training, for deliberate practice. One, I hope to use it to be able to build community so that, for example, I want to build a feature in here to have different communities for different language pairs. That way there could be a community for languages of lesser diffusion. Someone mentioned that in the Q&A earlier. That way you could potentially with this facilitate over large distances constructive feedback, a sense of community with other language pairs. So in a nutshell, that is that's TERP and how I think it can contribute to deliberate practice. And to wrap up, I just wanted to, we won't have time to go over it or to use it, but I did want to show you, let's see, right here. I did want to show you briefly the handout that will be sent to you all in the follow-up email. And I hope that you'll actually take this to heart and try to use it. I was talking about all of these concepts with deliberate practice with someone who I know who administers the interpreting program for a large hospital system. And they told me that they had actually found, since they've been evaluating interpreters and training new interpreters, that in a lot of cases, new interpreters were better than interpreters that had years and years of experience. And it was because of isolation. It was because of a lack of constructive feedback on the part of those really experienced interpreters. And so this handout is essentially just a reminder of what the requirements are for deliberate practice. And it's an invitation to plan, execute, and monitor your performance. That's how you become an expert in something. And so this is the plan. And the big invitation here is to think about, okay, what's my goal? Is it register? Is it not omitting details? Is it memory? How am I going to practice that? How often? In what context? When? But what is my methodology for monitoring performance? Am I going to record myself and compare it with pre-existing recorded interpretations? Or simply compare it with the utterance itself? I'm able to analyze that whether or not I omitted something once I hear my recording. Or are you going to have peer feedback? Next, how are you going to repeat the exercise and correct those errors? How are you going to actively improve? So plan, here's the plan. Execute, you actually have to go out and do it, and monitor. So this part right here is extremely important. And I separated it into two areas, a self-reflective learning plan. And so this would be something like recording yourself, but then a peer mentor learning plan. And so that's simply who's going to give you feedback and how are they going to give you feedback. So I'll invite you to look into that handout, and I really appreciate everyone's time. I know that Analia is letting me know that we need to go on to questions, and I would just end with asking everyone to, let's see here, to reach out to me if they have questions about TERP or about deliberate practice in general. Here's my contact info. And thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'd love to hear the questions that you have.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Gilbert. And I apologize. I was clicking, I saw like people are raising their hands, and I was trying to figure out who's raising their hand, and I raised my hand. So there you go. So I apologize about that. Wonderful presentation. Wow. People are fascinated with it. I saw a lot of questions on the Q&A. One of them, if you can elaborate a little bit more, is about the TERP itself. They were asking, if this free? How do I go about it? Can you just tell us, kind of like elaborate on how can people start with this app?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. One thing, so the platform, it was in beta until about 5 months ago, and it's out of beta now. I've been using it with my classes, and it is not a free service. I do hope to collaborate with people in the future to, for example, create dialogues for languages of lesser diffusion for language pairs that don't have as many resources. And for those language pairs, I do plan on making it free, just because that's an initiative that I really think is important. But for the dialogues that are Spanish to English right now, access to them is not free, it's subscription based. I do plan on modifying the pricing model soon, just because I've realized that most contexts this will be used this will be used for courses that are like 40-hour courses or university courses. And so I probably will modify the subscription model so that it's based on either 6 months or a year. Right now, you can just pay for a month at a time. And one thing is that anyone, no matter who, they can create an account for free and then get 2 separate 1-week free trials, and they can decide when to start those free trials. And there are 2 dialogues on the platform that are free, the demo and then one other that is, it just happens to be an open source dialogue.
Wonderful. That's very, very helpful. And you have provided everyone your information so people can reach out to you directly. So everybody, please take a photo of the screen so you can reach out to Dr. Gilbert directly if you have any more questions. I do see some questions on the chat. If you already answered them, please let me know. One, I don't think this was asked. Where do we go to train for long consecutive? Any resources? I have been looking and emailing people for a year about this skill.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that the training that I received for long consecutive, it was very much like in the style of diplomatic interpreting. So think like UN, EU. And so what we would always use were the speeches that you can get in the EU speech repository. So the European, I'm not sure the exact name, it's something like European Commission. They are continuously producing speeches that range in between like 5 to 12 minutes, I think. And they're on a whole myriad of topics. And so that's a super good resource because that's about the length that you want to shoot for, 5 minutes. Longer than that, you know, is a lot more difficult. And then essentially listen to the speech, take notes, record your interpretation, and then you can listen to your interpretation and listen to the recording kind of in 30-second chunks, comparing them and kind of see how you fare. That's what I would suggest.
Thank you. Excellent suggestion. Let's see. And if you see any question that you would like to answer as well, please go ahead with it. Let's see. Okay, so I did believe you asked this question. One is TERP app available to people outside your course?
Yes, 100%. It's been available for a few months now, so anyone can make an account, and then it's I think on the home page as you scroll down, there will be a bright pink button that says pricing, and so you can see kind of the details for that. I know that I do have a LinkedIn account for it, and I offer what are called TERP points for people who comment and answer silly questions when I post that a new dialogue is published. And those TERP points often result in a subscription that lasts a few months. And so the TERP points aren't just like 10 points to Gryffindor. They actually have
Uh-huh.
real value.
They do. I like
Yeah.
that. Okay, I may have to look into it. Okay, I'm looking at a few questions, and they are kind of like the same theme, and it has to do with, I guess, in a nutshell, people want to know how many languages are available in TERP.
That's a perfect question. And I know, my background's in Spanish and Portuguese, and so I teach Spanish at UVU. So the only dialogues available right now are Spanish. But
Okay.
within the next year, I want to, like someone suggested, I believe in the Q&A, create English to English versions of all of the dialogues that we currently have. That way you can practice out of English into any target language and set up communities and practice with each other and get feedback from each other. And so that's something that is definitely coming, that I plan on doing. And I think probably the next languages that I would go into for language specific resources would likely be Chinese and Arabic.
Okay, now, within Chinese and Arabic, there are dialogues. Like I know Chinese, we have Mandarin,
Yeah.
Cantonese, and Arabic. Do you have like any specific already dialects chosen? Or you haven't
No.
gone that far?
I would need to have some solid collaborators for that. I know that
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's more common to interpret, like for interpreters in the US. I don't know if it's more common to do Cantonese or Mandarin. That's an interesting, sort of question. And then
Mm-hmm.
for Arabic, that's a lot of different dialects.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, so I'm getting ahead of myself here. Okay, let's go to the next question. This one may be a little bit more practical. What is the advantage of using Vimeo versus the voice recorder on your phone?
So the advantage with using Vimeo, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a huge advantage. I use it with my classes because I can see where my students are on the screen
Mm-hmm.
while I'm listening to their recording. And so I really like that because then I can see exactly which line of dialogue they're on for the audio that I'm hearing. But after this summer, I hope to implement a feature so that there's just one recording that's a lot shorter for every single line of dialogue, and that will kind of make that obsolete. But I like Vimeo
Mm-hmm.
because when I practice, I can then take the embed code that Vimeo gives you, throw it into that form at the end of the dialogue on TERP, and then on my profile on TERP, I can just go directly to the practice session and it will already have the embedded video right there. I don't have to go to a different website. It's on TERP already.
Mm-hmm. So it's something that is more practical in a sense for it depends on the goal, right? That you're
Yeah,
trying to achieve. Okay. Let's
100%.
see.
But I would say that just linking the visual with the audio, that's what makes Vimeo
Mm-hmm.
a good option, or any other screen recorder. You can screen record on your computer without using Vimeo. But yeah, I mean, I always started when I started out, I recorded on my phone too, and so there's nothing wrong with that.
Okay. Excellent. Here's another question. Can the script be visually recorded for ASL interpreters?
That's something that I want to implement in the future as well. It's not currently something that we've experimented with yet. UVU actually has an extremely strong deaf studies and ASL interpreting program. And so I definitely have the colleagues to start experimenting with that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's on my large very long list of to-dos.
You have more things to more tasks to accomplish now that people are asking all these questions, right?
Yeah, and I've gotten really good ideas the more I talk with people about the platform, and it's exciting.
That's wonderful. Okay, let's see if I see. And again, please, Dr. Gilbert, if you see anything, go ahead. I'm scrolling through the questions, the Q&A. Oh, okay, here's another one. What are some tips on how to encourage interpreters to provide objective feedback on themselves? I feel we have a harder time, oh yes, a harder time being objective with our own performance. Oh yes, absolutely.
That's very true. And it's good that you bring that up, Analia, because that was the question that caught my eye. How to be objective with yourself. That's really hard because oftentimes you just don't know what you don't know. That's something one of my past professors would constantly tell us. And there's a funny saying in Spanish, it's mi ignorancia no tiene límite. You know, my ignorance knows no limits. And I don't know that there's a really good workaround for that. If I'm being completely honest, you can't give yourself objective feedback, and for that matter, no one else really can give you objective feedback. They can only give you subjective feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why community is so important, because you have a
Mm-hmm.
group of people. And you know, I've done a lot of research, for example, on post editing, and that's where you edit machine translation to correct it as a translator. And what I found in a study I did was that people only agreed on translating something. Like, I had a group of 30 post editors, English to Spanish, and they translated a piece of text the same way, something like only 5% of the time. It's not common. It's not common for humans to agree, especially in translation and interpreting. And so I think you have to build up a body of potential interpretations, and you have to train yourself on, with a community, debating the merits of each different interpretation, and also recognizing that there's a lot of different ways to fry an egg, and it's okay.
Oh gosh, I love
different.
that. Oh, that is so funny. Dr. Gilbert, before I let you go, because we're at the top of the hour, and I know you're running late for a class, but you know, this question is so true, because it is hard to listen to oneself. Like, our voice sounds different to what we hear, like in recorded. And you brought up a point, how community is critical, right? Because then we can give each other feedback. And yes, even though it might not be 100% objective, at least it's not our own feedback, because we know, most of us, we will say we are our worst critic, right? We're too hard on ourselves. And I think sometimes people can look at us, give us their feedback, and it might be a more, I guess, the valuable feedback that our own, because they are not looking at ourselves with that critical attitude that we have, right?
Yeah,
So,
I totally agree. I think that the more we engage with one another, the more we'll realize, one, that there's just a lot of different ways to approach any problem in interpreting, and two, that we have so much to learn from each other. And so that's something that I hope to build this platform into, as a tool for community.
wow.
And oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. Please finish. And I just wanted to thank you. So please go ahead and finish your thought.
Well, I just wanted to thank you, Analia, and Andrew, and everyone at CCC. It's been a really good experience, and I am really grateful for having the time to talk to you all about deliberate practice and how important I think it is for the profession. And I apologize that I have to leave for a class right now. I'd love to spend more time, but reach out to me and I'm available, and thank you once again.
No, thank you, Dr. Gilbert. Everybody, round of applause to Dr. Gilbert, and have a wonderful, fantastic day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.